European history. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. Background. When World War I ended in 1918, the victorious nations called a peace conference in the capital of France, Paris, known as the Paris Conference of 1919, to determine the fate of the defeated nations and have peace once again. The peace conference started in January 1919 in the different palaces of Paris and went on for 6 months until June 1919. 32 countries attended this conference, but the defeated nations like Germany were not invited to participate in the discussions. Instead, the major decisions were made by the three most important leaders of the victorious powers, who included President Woodrow Wilson of USA, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain, as well as George Clemenceau, who was the Prime Minister of France. Prime Minister Orlando of Italy was also in attendance. George Clemenceau chaired the conference as the host and greatly influenced its outcomes. Each of the big three men had different interests, as shown below. George Clemenceau. He was the Prime Minister of France. He was the chairman of the Paris Conference. He had witnessed the humiliation of France during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871 and the annexation of Alsace and Lorraine by Germany. He was now the chairman of a conference conducted in the same hall of mirrors, with the Germans crowned the king, having defeated France. This time, Germany was a defeated nation. As a result, George Clemenceau wanted Germany to be punished too, France to be compensated for war damages, and to protect France. He therefore pushed the Allies for severe and humiliating terms against Germany in the mood of revenge. Woodrow Wilson. He was the President of USA. He came to Paris with a document that had 14 points. These were his ideas and ideas of his political party on what to do after World War I. He wanted measures that were to prevent the world from another world war. He wanted Germany to be punished for her aggression but not to be humiliated, i.e., peace without victory. He also suggested the creation of an international organization to maintain peace, among other points, and granting of independence to those nationalities in Europe that had been under foreign domination before World War I. David Lloyd George. He was the Prime Minister of Britain. Britain wanted Germany to be punished and Kaiser William to be tried for having caused World War I. However, Lloyd George had fears that harsh conditions on Germany were not to be accepted by Germany, yet the British wanted a punitive treaty on Germany. He therefore favoured a generous peace treaty that would allow the British trade to thrive or prosper. The aims of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. As soon as the peace conference began, there were disagreements as to what the conference was aiming at. Each of the victor nations had their own set of aims, but overall, the Paris statesmen aimed at achieving the following objectives: to establish lasting peace, security and stability in Europe and the world at large. This was European history. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. To disarm as much as possible both the vanquished, defeated and the victor nations, as an effort to dispel or end the race among powers for the production of deadly weapons, which had partly caused the World War I in 1914. To redraw the political map of Europe as a means to restore the continental balance of power, because Germany had upset it way back in 1871 when Bismarck created, in the place of France, the German Empire to become the master on land. To punish Germany and her allies for causing a war and to permanently destroy their capabilities to sustain a war of revenge. The French in particular wanted Germany to be broken into a collection of smaller states. To reward the victor powers of the World War I from the territories of the defeated nations. To institute international cooperation among all the powers and their associated partners. To uphold the principle of nationalism and self-determination by giving independence to small and oppressed nations. This was a result of the realization that a great desire for self-rule, independence, had greatly contributed to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. To conclude the Paris Conference, the Allied powers of Britain, France, USA and Italy pushed their differences aside and signed the Treaty of Versailles with Germany on 28 June 1919. This treaty was signed in the Hall of Mirrors, from where the newly created German Empire was declared in 1871 following a successful war against France and the associated humiliation thereof. It now symbolized a national catastrophe for Germany. The fate of Germany as a defeated nation had therefore been sealed at Versailles Palace. Note: the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 was signed between the Allies and Germany, and therefore it concerned only Germany. However, the Allies signed other subsidiary treaties with other defeated nations between 1919 and 1923. These included the Treaty of St. Germain with Austria of 1919. This was signed between Austria and the victorious powers. By its terms, It separated Austria from Hungary and confirmed that Austria was no longer a leading power in the Union. Austria's territories of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia were declared into a new state, called Yugoslavia, which also included the former Kingdom of Serbia. Bohemia and Moravia became the new state of Czechoslovakia. Austria lost Galicia to Poland and Holland to Italy. Her army was restricted to only 30,000 men. She was forbidden to ever unite with Germany. Austria suffered severe economic problems after the war as much of its industry went to European history. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. This treaty dealt with Bulgaria. Bulgaria had played a relatively smaller part in the war compared to other nations, and this is why she was treated less harshly. By its terms, she lost lands to Greece, Romania and Yugoslavia and its access to the Mediterranean Sea. She was to limit her armed forces to only 20,000 soldiers, had to pay a war indemnity fine of £100 million. A Treaty of Trianon with Hungary of 1920. This dealt with Hungary and was signed on June 18, 1920. Like the Treaty of Saint-Germain, the Treaty of Trianon involved the transfer of territories. By its terms, the territory of Transylvania were transferred to the state of Romania. Slovakia and Ruthenia were transferred to Czechoslovakia. Slovenia and part of Croatia under Hungary was added to Yugoslavia. The Treaty of Sevres with Turkey of 1920. This was the last of the treaties to be arranged by the victorious nations. It dealt with Turkey and was signed in August 1920. By its terms, Turkey lost the territory of Smyrna to Greece. Syria was declared a mandate territory under the French. She was also to lose the straits running directly into the Black Sea. Note: unlike the other treaties, Sevres was not a successful treaty. The Turks were outraged by it, and thus the Turkish nationalists led by Mustafa Kemal challenged the terms of the treaty by force. When they forced the Greeks out of Smyrna, by the terms of the Treaty of Lausanne of 1923, Smyrna was returned to Turkey. It should be noted that there is a difference between the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 and the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. The Paris Peace Conference was the major conference held in Paris by the representatives of the victorious nations after World War I. It was held primarily to decide the fate of the defeated powers. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919, on the other hand, was one of the 5 treaties signed in the Paris Peace Conference, and it was prepared by the Allies for Germany to sign alone, although its final contents included some aspects of the other treaties signed. European history. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. There was the War Guilt Clause, Article 231. By this clause or term, the Allied powers solely or entirely blamed Germany for causing World War I. This was unfair to Germany because she was accused of a crime committed by all the great powers that had fought in World War I. The Territorial Adjustment Clause was another term that was unfair to Germany. By this clause, Germany was forced to lose her territories in Europe. For example, the German province of East Prussia was cut off from the rest of Germany through the creation of a Polish corridor. The purpose of this corridor was to give the newly created Polish state an outlet to the Baltic Sea for security reasons. Poland was also given part of Posen. Therefore, Poland had been strengthened at the expense of Germany, which annoyed the Germans. To the Poles also were surrendered the rich industrial areas in Silesia to boost her economy. Alsace and Lorraine were also returned to France. Germany also lost Memel to Lithuania, Eupen and Normandy to Belgium, and Schleswig to Denmark. This weakened her politically and also crippled her economy. Similarly, the German port of Dazin was also declared a free city by the principal Allied powers and would be placed under the League of Nations. Also, the German territory to the west of the Rhine was to be occupied by Allied troops for 15 years. This was therefore a great humiliation to Germany. The Reparation Compensation Clause was another severe or harsh term. By this clause, Germany was to compensate the Allied powers for all the damages, human and material, caused during World War I. Germany therefore had to pay reparations war fine to the Allied powers. The exact figure was not agreed till 1921, when it was set at £6,600 million or $6.6 billion. This amount was too big for a country that had just been at war, and therefore it made the Germans bitter. Though terms had not been changed under the Young Plan in 1929, Germany would not have finished this bill till 1984. In addition, as compensation for the damage of the coal mines in the northeast of France, and as part payment of the total reparations due, Germany gave to France the coal mines of the Saar region. After 15 years, the inhabitants of this area would be asked to decide under which government they wished to be placed. The annexation of this region further created bitterness among the Germans. The disarmament clause was another unfair turn to Germany because it reduced her military power. The German army and navy were reduced to a minimum and conscription was abolished, i.e. Germany was required to abolish compulsory military services and the soldiers therefore had to be volunteers. She was also forced to surrender nearly all her war fleet, to have no air force and to keep a smaller army of only 100,000 men. She was also to have no tank, armored vehicles, submarines or aircrafts. The German navy was also limited to only 6 small battleships and the naval personnel not to exceed 15,000 sailors. In addition, the Rhineland became a demilitarized zone, i.e. Germany was to demilitarize all their territory on the left bank of the Rhine River and also that of the right bank to a depth of 50 kilometers 31 miles. The Rhineland was a border area between Germany and France. This was therefore done for the sake of protecting France from the German aggression. The decolonization clause was also unfair to Germany. By this clause, Germany surrendered to the principal Allied powers and their associated powers all her rights over her overseas colonies. These were declared mandate colonies to be later administered on behalf of the League of Nations. For example, Southwest Africa, Namibia went to South Africa, Tanganyika, and part of European history, the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 was a settlement/peace agreement/elaborate document that was signed on 28th of June 1919 in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles Palace in France. It was signed towards the end of the Paris Peace Conference between the victorious nations of Britain, France, USA, Italy, and Germany, the defeated nation. The major personalities were President Woodrow Wilson of USA, Lloyd George the Prime Minister of Britain, and George Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France. The treaty was arranged by the above representatives of the victorious powers who compelled or forced the German representatives to sign. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 had the following achievements which contributed towards peace in Europe. It concluded or ended World War I. It was precisely the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 that ended World War I, thereby bringing about relative peace in Europe and the world at large. At the Versailles Palace, Germany was forced to denounce war and accept the war guilt clause. The terms she agreed to were intended to weaken her and her allies so much that it became almost impossible for such powers to declare another war of such magnitude. This ushered in relative peace until 1939 when yet another war of the world scale broke out. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 created a peacekeeping body called the League of Nations. While at Versailles, the peacemakers unanimously agreed to adopt Woodrow Wilson's 14th point, which advocated for the formation of an international body to keep global peace and guarantee the independence of all states, both small and great, and thus they created the League of Nations. This was the first of its kind in the history of Europe. The body undertook a wide range of humanitarian, political and economic missions which fostered peace and harmony as well as economic recovery and development in the world. For example, it set up the World Health Organization, who in 1923 that organized medical assistance and distribution of vaccines to combat the epidemics of typhus, cholera, dysentery, malaria, smallpox, leprosy, heart disease, and others which had swept Europe before, during, and after the war. It also established the International Labour Organization, ILO, which improved the living and working conditions of workers in Europe. It also helped in the repatriation of prisoners of war. For example, it resettled from Russia over 427,000 prisoners of war. It also resolved disputes among European states. For example, the 1921 Åland Island dispute between Sweden and Finland was amicably resolved by the League in favour of Finland. It also resolved the boundary dispute between Poland and Germany in the northern Silesia in 1921. It was, however, undercapitalized, ill-equipped, which led to its failure by the late 1930s. Though its lifespan was short-lived from 1929 to 1945, the League of Nations succeeded in settling a number of social, political and economic problems in Europe. The Versailles Peace Treaty also led to the creation of new states in Europe. For example, Hungary was separated from Austria to become an independent state. Bohemia was combined with Moravia to create the new state of Czechoslovakia. Yugoslavia was also created from Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and the former Kingdom of Serbia. Poland, which was formerly divided among Russia, Germany, and Austria, was declared independent and given access to Baltic Sea through the port of Danzig. Also, Romania became an independent state. The state of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were granted independence from Germany, which it had grabbed from the Russian Empire. In 1918, during the course of World War I, while Finland was also granted complete independence. European history, the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919, and balance of power. Thus at Versailles, the Allied powers revived the status quo by granting independence to parts of the aggressive powers, while elsewhere huge territories of their empires were given out to new states or simply declared as mediated zones under the League of Nations. The total effect of this was that each of these powers were reduced to their original boundaries. For example, Germany lost to Britain and France all her African colonies as mandated territories. She also lost Alsace-Lorraine to France, Saarland to the League of Nations, Upper Silesia, West Prussia, and Posen lost to Poland and the port of Danzig. Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, which she had grabbed from Russia in 1918, were also declared independent states. Austria lost Bohemia and Moravia to the new state of Czechoslovakia, Bosnia and Herzegovina and the former kingdom of Serbia all went to the new state of Yugoslavia. Hungary lost Transylvania to Romania, Slovakia and Ruthenia to Czechoslovakia, Slovenia and Croatia to Yugoslavia. Turkey lost Minor to Greece, while Syria was mandated under French custody, and several of her territories like Kuwait, Iraq and Iran, among others, became independent. Bulgaria also lost lands to Greece, Romania and Yugoslavia. This policy greatly weakened such states to the effect that they could hardly pursue aggression in the face of the reviving strength of the traditional allies. This ushered in relative balance of power in Europe, at least during the early years of the interwar period. NBE, however, readjustments were perceived by Germany and her allies as rather too unrealistic and instead encouraged them to remobilize their resources, rearm the armies and eventually invaded the newly created states in order to recover the lost territory. The result was World War II in 1939. The treaty also guaranteed the neutrality of international waters of Europe. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 declared free navigation on all international water bodies except those that were territorial. For example, the Dardanelles mouth of Baltic Sea, which was the source of economic conflict among European powers as far back as 1850s, was open to the ships of all European nations at all times. This promoted free navigation as well as international trade in Europe, which was a major achievement since the treaty had removed the trade barriers that had hitherto formally hindered economic cooperation in Europe. The treaty upheld the principle of nationalism and self-determination. This is justified by the fact that small nations and oppressed minorities across Europe were either granted independence, as decreed in the Versailles Peace Act, or allowed to decide their destiny through referenda. For example, countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Kuwait and Iraq among others were liberated from the Turkish and Austrian dominance and thus became independent states, while elsewhere the oppressed peoples were allowed to determine their political destiny through plebiscite arrangements. For example, a referendum was held in Upper Silesia which had a mixture of Germans and Poles. 60% voted for union with Germany and 40% favoured Poland. They were eventually united with Germany. Schleswig was also reunited with Denmark through a similar arrangement. Though the defeated peoples were subjected to foreign domination, a fact that could seemingly contravene the spirit of nationalism, such dominations were time-bound and largely aimed at ensuring peace and stability over Europe. For example, the occupation of Germany by the Allied forces was intended to ensure Germany's compliance to the European history of the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. Though Bismarck attempted to revive it, his diplomatic maneuvers were largely intended to consolidate Germany's supremacy at the expense of European stability. No wonder it collapsed with his downfall in 1890. It was therefore the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 that brought back a meaningful European diplomacy, where various powers of Europe agreed to a system of dialogue and collective action against emerging continental and world problems. It also managed to disarm Germany, thereby maintaining relative peace in Europe. The war had occurred partly due to Germany's heavy arms production or armament. Thus, to contain the possibility of another such disaster, the victor powers issued the disarmament clause, through which Germany's army was reduced to 100,000 men. Conscription was banned, whereby Germany was required to abolish compulsory military service, and therefore the soldiers had to be volunteers. She was also not allowed armored vehicles, submarines or aircrafts. The Navy could only build 6 small battleships with no submarines, the naval personnel not to exceed 15,000 men, and to abandon all military and naval aviation by 1st October 1919. Thus restrained or weakened to such an extent, Germany's ability to wage a war of revenge was curtailed, at least for a significant period of time, between 1919 and 1939. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 is also credited for having granted Poland, a landlocked country, access to the sea, which promoted her economic and political development. Poland was given a corridor of land through Germany to the port of Danzig and thus to the Baltic Sea. This enabled Poland to strengthen her army and also become involved in international trade, hence gaining economic prosperity. The treaty enabled different countries of Europe to regain their territories formerly annexed by Germany. For example, France regained her mineral-rich provinces of Alsace and Lorraine and the Saar fields which Germany had annexed in 1871. Denmark also, through a plebiscite referendum arrangement, regained her Schleswig territory which she had lost to Germany in 1864. The statesmen undertook such a realistic move because such disputed territories rightfully belonged to such nation. By so doing, the Versailles Peace Treaty, at least for a while, ended the long-aging continental enmity or revenge sentiments against Germany since the mid-19th century. Failures of the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. The Versailles Peace Treaty failed to distribute or apportion the blame for causing World War I properly. By the War Guilt Clause, the settlement put it on Germany that she was solely or entirely responsible for the outbreak of the World War I and all the losses incurred by the Allied powers. This left the Germans very bitter because even the Allied powers had contributed to the outbreak of the war, and therefore the Germans wanted to revenge. This undermined efforts towards promoting international peace. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 failed to disarm other powers. As already noted, Germany lost her navy, air force, and the number of soldiers was reduced to only 100,000 soldiers. While Germany was disarmed, the victorious nations did not disarm themselves and were now a threat to Germany. Consequently, in the 1930s, Germany embarked on rearmament programs so as to defend herself, thus resulting into military competition that eventually led to the outbreak of World War II. By 1939, European history, the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919, £1 billion. This was too much for a country which had just been at war when even her industries were destroyed. It therefore left the Germans bitter with the Allied powers. This bitterness eventually forced Germany to provoke the Allied powers into World War II by 1939. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 was dictated onto the Germans to sign, which caused discontent, hence undermining efforts towards peace. It was Britain, France, and USA who arranged this treaty and dominated the major issues in the settlement. The treaty therefore caused discontent because the Germans were not called to the discussions and they therefore regarded it very unfair. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 undermined the Weimar Republic. This was the newly Republican government that had been established in Germany in 1919 following the abdication and subsequent escape of Kaiser William II to Holland in 1918. It was therefore this Weimar Republic that accepted the harsh terms of the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 on behalf of the Germans. Consequently, it was blamed to have concluded the fighting too early and accepting that Germany was a weak and defeated nation. It therefore lost popularity among the Germans and it started getting serious opposition. This made it very weak, which eventually led to its collapse by 1933. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 created several independent states that later became a problem, and this was a major failure. It created Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. This increased on the number of states in Eastern Europe. This consequently increased on the borders, thus creating many tariff points to cross. This later created trade problems. The treaty failed to check on the German rearmament programs. While the Versailles Peace Treaty disarmed Germany, it did not put up measures to stop Germany from rearming herself in the later years, yet this was highly expected. Consequently, in the 1930s, Germany under Adolf Hitler started rearming herself to the level of the Allied powers. When this was done, Germany became very aggressive, which threatened international peace again and eventually led to the outbreak of World War II in 1939. The treaty failed to cater for Italy and Japan. It should be noted that Italy and Japan had fought with the Allied powers against Germany up to 1919 when she was defeated with her allies. However, according to the Italians, the rewards given to their country by the Versailles Peace Treaty were not commensurate to the efforts they had put in during World War I. For example, no single German colony was given to Italy, yet Britain and France took over Tanganyika and Togo among others, respectively. The same was true with Japan. Italy and Japan therefore became very bitter and therefore they later decided to form an alliance of the Axis powers Italy, Germany and Japan. This revived the alliance system in Europe, which eventually sparked off World War II in 1939. It led to the rise of fascist or dictatorial regimes in Germany and Italy. In Germany, Adolf Hitler campaigned the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 and therefore he received massive support from the Germans, which enabled him to take over power from the Weimar Republic in 1933. In Italy, Benito Mussolini was given support because of his criticism of the unfairness of the Versailles Peace Treaty. To Italy, This assisted him to overthrow the liberal and democratic government, and he established a dictatorial regime in Italy in 1922. These two leaders became very aggressive, which undermined peace in Europe and eventually sparked off World War I and II in 1939. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 failed to ensure lasting peace in Europe because it led to the European history. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 being included in those countries by the Versailles Peace Treaty. This was interpreted as aggression, and the Allied powers therefore decided to declare war on Germany in 1939. The strengths of the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 had a number of strengths, and it is from these strengths that the treaty is considered to be realistic or genuine in its attempts to bring out lasting peace in Europe. The following were some of the major strengths of the treaty. The disarmament clause against Germany was a major strength of the treaty because it restrained Germany's aggression, which had become a threat to the security of other European countries. For example, Germany had previously threatened the British interests in South Africa through the Kruger Telegram of 1895, as well as the interests of France in Morocco and North Africa between 1905 and 1911. She had also violated the Belgian neutrality and independence in 1914, and finally she attacked Russia and France. It's this aggression that had led to the collapse of European peace by sparking off World War I in 1914. When Germany was disarmed, therefore, there was relative peace in Europe after World War I. Similarly, the demilitarization of the Rhinelands was another necessary or realistic measure of strength of the treaty. It was stated in the treaty that the German troops and other military installations or facilities were not to be put in the Rhineland area, which was between France and Germany. Instead, an army of occupation was stationed in the Rhinelands, which prevented the German government from attacking her neighbours like France easily, at least in the short run. The harsh war reparation clause imposed on Germany was also a major strength of the treaty, since it restrained her from being aggressive again. Germany had involved the Allied powers into a 4 years war. In retaliation, the powers asked Germany to pay a very high war indemnity or a fine worth £6,600 million or $6.6 billion to compensate the Allied powers for all the damages suffered during World War I. This weakened Germany economically, hence restraining her from getting involved in actions that would lead to another war immediately after World War I. The decolonization clause was also a realistic measure of strength because it weakened Germany economically. By this clause, Germany lost her overseas colonies like Southwest Africa, Namibia, Tanganyika, Rwanda, Togo and Cameroon, which became mandated states under the League of Nations. Therefore, Germany could not get raw materials or manpower from the above colonies to enable her wage another war. The treaty also created the League of Nations as a peacekeeping body, which was a major strength. This was because this body undertook major steps to address the various political, social and economic challenges in Europe after World War I. For example, it settled minor disputes like the one between Sweden and Finland in 1921 over the Åland Island, as well as Greece and Bulgaria in 1925, among others. It further organized medical attention for the war victims and settled refugees. Above all, it kept Europe generally at peace between 1920 and 1939. It was, however, underfunded and ill-equipped, which led to its failure. There is no doubt that if this body had been well supported, it would have been a permanent and meaningful organization. The return of Alsace and Lorraine to France was also realistic in the preservation of world peace and therefore a major strength of the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. These two provinces were taken. European history. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. World War I. The restoration of these provinces to France therefore reduced the French hostility towards Germany, which was a good move towards restoring peace in Europe. The granting of independence to countries like Poland, Serbia, Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia by the subsidiary treaties of the Versailles Peace Settlement of 1919 was a major strength. This was because the subjection of these states to the big powers like Austria, Turkey and Germany had been the cause of extreme nationalism in states like Bosnia and Herzegovina, which sparked off World War I in 1914. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 created democratic institutions in some of the newly created states, which was another area of strength. In Hungary, for example, a Hungarian democratic monarchy was established as Hungary was separated from the despotic monarchy of Austria. Democratic institutions were also established in Czechoslovakia, which was also declared independent. The weaknesses of the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. Was the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 realistic/fair? Note: the overall objective of the settlement was largely overshadowed by its unfairness and weaknesses. The weaknesses of the treaty constitute its unrealistic or unfair manifestations. The Versailles Peace Treaty became too unrealistic to the defeated powers and actually sowed the seeds for the subsequent World War II. Its unfairness made the Germans to reject the treaty, hence leading to the World War II. Its unfairness again explains why it was bound to lead to unrest or instabilities in Europe. Its unfairness also explains why it was bound to fail to bring about lasting peace in Europe and the world at large. Again, its unfairness made the viability of this treaty questionable right from the start. The Allies at Versailles attained victory without peace because Germany was set to undo the terms of the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 in the later years. The framers of the Versailles Peace Treaty were too emotional and highly insensitive to the Germany's position of defeat, and they overlooked the possibility of revenge. The popular outcry at Versailles by the big powers was that Germany must pay in Kaiser William II be hanged. Thus, to establish whether or not the treaty was realistic, one needs to make an assessment of the terms and all that which transpired during and shortly after signing of the treaty. To some scholars, the treaty had several weaknesses and therefore unrealistic, while to others, it was a realistic treaty as seen from the strengths above. Let's take the unrealistic part of the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. The foundation of the Versailles Peace Treaty lacked universal legitimacy or acceptance. Many of the provisions of the settlement were based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which even the Allied powers did not welcome right from the start. The points were a result of Woodrow Wilson's own analysis of the cause of the war and did not bear the views and acceptance of the Versailles statesmen, not even those of the victor powers. Thus, Woodrow Wilson's strenuous effort to secure their acceptance by the Versailles peacemakers caused opposition from the European nations. 4. European history. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. Example: George Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, rebuked the point, saying the good Lord had only 10 commandments. Is it to suppose Wilson had drafted his own numerous opinions and simply dumped them to the peacemakers? This shows that the viability of the Versailles Peace Treaty was questionable right from the start. This is why it was rejected by Germany and therefore couldn't bring about lasting peace in Europe. The Versailles Peace Treaty was simply dictated unto the Germans to sign, which caused discontent. The Paris Peace Conference was dominated by the major Allied powers, namely Britain, France, and USA, at the expense of the defeated nations and even smaller allies. Actually, from the start to its end, the conference was dominated by the three outstanding personalities of President Woodrow Wilson of USA, Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Britain, and George Clemenceau of France. Even the representatives of the associated nations, smaller allies to Allied powers, attended largely as mere spectators. No negotiations were made with the defeated powers because none of them was invited. Instead, the major decision-makers simply drafted hash terms on the vanquished and later summoned them for signature. For example, after drafting the Versailles Treaty, the powers gave Germany only 5 days within which to accept and sign the treaty, or else she risked another war. The Versailles statesmen were so determined to force Germany to sign the treaty, as George Lloyd reiterated. The Germans say they will not sign, the newspapers say they will not sign, and that politicians say the same. We say, gentlemen, you must sign. If you don't do so in Versailles, you shall do so in Berlin. This manifests the fact that the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 was simply dictated rather than a negotiated treaty, making it very unrealistic, rejected by Germany, and thus incapable of bringing about lasting peace in Europe. It also unfairly confiscated the defeated nations' territorial possessions, hence creating bitterness among them. For example, Germany was forced to renounce all her colonial possessions in Africa, and they went to Britain and France as mandated territories. She was also compelled to surrender Alsace and Lorraine to France and an enormous territory to the new states of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Austria lost Bohemia, Moravia, Bosnia and Herzegovina to create the new states of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. Hungary was strictly forbidden union with Austria, but as if not enough, she lost Slovenia and Croatia to Yugoslavia, Transylvania to Romania, Slovakia and Ruthenia to Czechoslovakia, among other territories. This was seen by the defeated nations as too malicious and not intended to promote harmony among the various nationalities of Europe. No wonder aggressive men like Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini eventually declared aggressions to regain such lost territories, thus leading to World War II. The Versailles Peace Treaty also unfairly disarmed the defeated Germany, whereas the treaty was set to disarm all powers, including the victors and the vanquished states, to the lowest point. Consistent with domestic safety, no serious attempts were ever made to disarm the Allies like Britain, USA, France and Russia. Instead, the disarmament was executed only on the defeated nation of Germany, as the victor powers increasingly pursued rearmament in readiness for an anticipated War of Revenge. For example, the German army was almost completely disbanded. It was reduced to only 100,000 men, no more was she to make military tanks, aircrafts and heavy artillery. Her navy was restricted to 15,000 sailors and only 6 small battleships. Austria's armed forces were reduced to European history, the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. While self-determination, as stressed by the treaty, was given to countries like Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia, the German-speaking peoples across the continent were being divided by the very terms of the Versailles Peace Treaty. For example, instead of incorporating and consolidating them into one German nation, many German-speaking peoples were put under the newly created countries and therefore governed by non-Germans. As a result, more than 3 Germans were put in Czechoslovakia, 2.5 into Poland and over 20 to Yugoslavia. This was perceived by many Germans as being very discriminative, insensitive to German nationalism, too unrealistic, and therefore inspired men like Hitler to invade such countries with the desire to liberate fellow Germans, which eventually sparked off World War II in 1939. The venue of the settlement also partly symbolized unfairness and thus prompted the Germans to reject it. The Hall of Mirrors within the Versailles Palace in Paris, where the post-war peacemakers chose to meet and subsequently sign the Versailles Peace Treaty, was perceived by the Germans as rather unfair because it was not neutral. This was because the hall was taken by many German patriots as a symbol of their might, because it was in this very hall where the German Empire was proclaimed in 1871 following the German defeat over France. This action had greatly humiliated or ashamed France, and as a result, the French mood right from 1871 was that of revenge. Therefore, the general feeling in Germany was that the peacemakers would have chosen a neutral position for their peace deliberations, preferably Switzerland and not in a French palace of Versailles. The war indemnity fine was unrealistically high and in fact unbearable to Germany. The £66,000 million was by far too high for Germany, a country whose economy had also been disastrously shattered by the war. To make matters worse, all her resources and industries which she could have exploited to raise the reparations, including the Saar coalfields, the Ruhr industrial region and the port of Danzig, were almost all grabbed by the victor powers. Many Europeans, both Germans and non-Germans, perceived it as being too unfair. The peacemaking delegates as Versailles ignored the advice by John Maynard Keynes, the economic advisor to the British delegation at the conference, to adjust the indemnity to £2,000 million. Such reparations eventually prompted Adolf Hitler to denounce the treaty and later declared aggression on continental Europe, hence leading to the outbreak of World War II. Besides, the Versailles Peace Treaty was rather too unrealistic to hold Germany solely responsible for causing World War I without considering the circumstances that prevailed in Europe at the time. It was illogical to blame Germany solely for the war when all powers of Europe became equally involved in the circumstances which precipitated the war by 1914. For example, as much as Germany was involved in the arms race, so were the British, French, Russians, Austrians and the Americans. Other powers were also equally involved in the rivalries, hostilities, mistrust and hatred that emerged out of the antagonistic alliances which also caused the war. Britain, France as well as Germany and her allies were all actively involved in the imperialism. Thus, to blame Germany alone, and for that matter imposing very harsh terms on her, were interpreted by the defeated nation of Germany as being too unrealistic. No wonder the treaty was rejected by Germany, and it therefore failed to bring about lasting peace in Europe and the world at large. The chairmanship of George Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, also made the Versailles European history, the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919, proposed sympathies and called for very harsh terms on the defeated so that they could not easily wage a war of revenge. His chairmanship, therefore, right from the very beginning, rendered the viability of the conference questionable and thus unable to bring about lasting peace in Europe. Apart from Germany, the treaty also left some Allied powers dissatisfied or unhappy. For example, Italy and Japan were poorly compensated for their role in the war, and therefore they soon deserted the Triple Entente. Prime Minister Orlando of Italy complained of poor reward as his country, Italy, was given small territories compared to the other allies. For example, she earned a little Italian Trentino and the small cities of Gorizia, Trieste and Pula. She was also given Tyrol, containing 250,000 Germans, and the Istrian Peninsula, containing 400,000 Yugoslavs. Dissatisfied with such small rewards, Prime Minister Orlando soon left the conference in protest. Japan also lost interest and pulled out by April 1920 due to poor compensation. This made Italy and Japan to join Germany and form the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Axis alliance, which led to the outbreak of World War II in 1939. The settlement also lacked a mechanism to protect the actions and mandate of the League of Nations that it had put in place to implement its terms. For example, it neither created an army nor a police force to enable the League of Nations implement effectively its orders. Because of this, therefore the League remained for most of its life a barking dog that could not bite. Its use of economic sanctions as a weapon also proved useless in the face of the growing era dictatorship in Europe. This is why by 1939, world dictators like Germany's Hitler, Japan's Hirohito, and Italy's Mussolini had withdrawn from the League and pursued aggression, which culminated in the occurrence of World War II. Generally, therefore, the absence of a means of enforcing the terms or resolutions of the Versailles Peace Treaty made it unable to bring about lasting peace in Europe. The Versailles Treaty was also characterized by great disagreements that were exhibited during its signing. The leading statesmen who dominated the conference almost failed to achieve common resolve on the fate of the defeated Germany, as they were almost torn apart by conflicting or divergent interests over the vanquished state of Germany. For example, George Clemenceau wanted permanently to weaken Germany so that it could never rise up in a war of revenge against allies, while Lloyd George of Britain was motivated by desire to regain all the German colonial possessions, so as to strengthen the British overseas empire. Italian Prime Minister Orlando wanted to attain as much territorial compensations as had been promised by the Allies. Woodrow Wilson of USA wanted justice extended to the defeated Germany so as to promote reconciliation, peace and international trade. Thus, such selfishness among the statesmen drew sharp arguments and counter-arguments, hence making Germany to doubt the credibility of the conference. This therefore prompted Germany to reject its terms, and this eventually led to the outbreak of World War II by 1939. Besides, the confessions and observations of the European statesmen at Versailles also reduced the treaty to an unfair settlement, making the Germans to reject it. For example, Woodrow Wilson, the architect of the 14 points upon which the treaty was built, said if he were a German, he would not have signed it. Harold Nicholson, a British diplomat and one of the leading British officials at the conference, said that we arrived determined that a peace of justice and wisdom should be negotiated. We left the conference conscious that the treaties imposed upon our enemies were neither just nor wise. Lloyd George, the British representative at the Versailles, though he received a hero's welcome. European history. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. The timing of the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 was also unrealistic or questionable. This is because the treaty was signed in 1919 when World War I had just ended, at a time when the emotions or tempers of the European powers were still very high. This therefore instilled the spirit of injustice and revenge in the statesmen of the victorious powers towards Germany, and therefore it was also bound to be rejected by the Germans. For example, when they arrived, many of these statesmen had pinned their coattails with posters carrying the slogan of Heil the Kaiser and make them paid. This was perceived as injustice by several Germans and therefore forced them to reject the treaty a few years later. This eventually led to the World War II in 1939. Besides, the settlement was signed on 28 June 1919, which was the wrong date and therefore made the treaty questionable right from the start. The Versailles Peace Treaty was signed on the very date Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia were assassinated on the 28 June 1919, which therefore coincided with the 5th anniversary of the Sarajevo double assassinations on 28 June 1914. The conclusion of the treaty on this day reminded the victorious powers of the role of Germany in sparking off World War I by encouraging Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia in 1914. Germany was therefore punished heavily at Versailles, which annoyed her so much because the impression it further gave was that Germany was being accused of the murders. Consequently, Germany rejected the treaty, which undermined peace in Europe. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 also created very weak states that could not defend themselves against the European dictators. For example, there was the creation of Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland and Yugoslavia. These were small and weak states, and therefore they were unable to defend themselves against external aggression, yet the authors of the settlement did not provide security measures to the new states. This is what inspired or encouraged Germany under Adolf Hitler to invade Poland in 1939, an event that sparked off World War II. It also contributed to the rise of dictators in the world. Men like Hitler of Germany, Hirohito Tojo, Japan and Mussolini blamed the inconsistency and unfairness of the peacemakers, hence making them to prepare for a war of revenge to overthrow the settlement. They accused their liberal governments of hypocrisy to accept and sign the unfair terms of the treaty and vowed to overthrow them and the Versailles peace settlement. This made them so popular in their countries. As a result, They mobilized and soon overthrew their liberal leaders and instituted dictatorship in their lands. This is how Mussolini and fascism took over power in Italy in 1922, the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler overthrew Weimar Republic in 1934, and Hirohito took over in Japan in 1926. These leaders became very aggressive in their foreign policies, which undermined peace in the world and eventually sparked off World War II in 1939. The impact of the Versailles Peace Treaty on Germany. The impact was largely destructive, and this is why Germany soon rejected the terms of the treaty and pursued rearmament as well as military aggression on Europe, such that by 1939, World War II broke out. Below were the effects of the Versailles Peace Treaty on Germany. She was forced to accept the war guilt clause, by which she was held solely responsible for causing World War I. This was unfair to Germany because she was accused of a crime committed by all the major European powers. This therefore made Germany to become bitter, hence making the Weimar European history the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. $1 million to Czechoslovakia and $2 million to the new state of Yugoslavia. This created bitterness among the Germans, who later rose up under Adolf Hitler to liberate their fellow Germans from foreign rule, something that finally sparked off World War II in 1939. She was compelled to pay a heavy war fine amounting to £6,600 million, which was unbearably too high for a country whose economy had been devastated by the war. She attempted partial payment in 1921, paid £50 million, but eventually it repudiated defaulted payment by 1929. The war reparations therefore shattered the German economy such that by 1930 she had the highest number of unemployed people in Europe, the highest rate of inflation, poverty, and general breakdown of her economy. Germany was severely disarmed by the Versailles Peace Treaty. For example, she was forced to reduce her army to only 100,000 men, to have only 6 small battleships, and not to have armored vehicles and aircrafts. Her navy was reduced to 15,000 sailors. This was too small an army which could not even provide sustainable domestic security. This therefore made Germany more vulnerable to any attack than ever before. The treaty further demilitarized the Rhineland, which was a region on the border between France and Germany. By the Versailles Peace Treaty, Germany was forbidden from maintaining an army and constructing forts on the banks of the River Rhine. By denying Germany a chance to militarize the Rhine, France was able to have the guarantee that the former could not attack her on the western flank of the Rhinelands. Germany lost an enormous territory in Europe through the territorial adjustment clause of the Versailles Peace Treaty. For example, she lost the mineral-rich lands of Alsace and Lorraine and the coal fields of Solent to France for a period of 20 years to compensate France because Germany had exploited her provinces since 1871. She also lost a long strip of land to Poland, including port of Danzig. She also lost to Denmark the province of Schleswig, which she had grabbed in 1864. She further lost Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, among other territories in Europe. Such territorial losses crippled the German economy more so because she lost a great deal of her industry and control of customs on port of Danzig. With the return of Alsace and Lorraine to France, Germany was also forced by the Versailles Peace Treaty to return other treasures like the arts of work, trophies, and flags to France. These had been confiscated by Germany during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. This also further annoyed the Germans, hence making them to reject the treaty. The Versailles Peace Treaty instigated a revolution in Germany by the right-wing opponents of President Tebbutt. This was after the German Weimar government accepted to sign what they opponents saw as an unrealistic Versailles Peace Treaty. The revolution was however suppressed, but it created instability in Germany which greatly undermined the survival of the Weimar Republic. In 1923, Germany lost to France her industrial territory of Ruhr when the French and Belgian troops invaded and occupied the disputed Ruhr region and simply took what was owed to them in the form of raw materials and goods. This was legal under the Treaty of the Versailles. Because of the treaty, the German Weimar government ordered the workers in the Ruhr region to go on strike so that they were not producing anything for the French to take. The French reacted harshly by killing over 100. European history, the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. It also led to hyperinflation in Germany. In the wake of trying to overcome the economic crisis created by the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919, the government reacted by printing more money. But this instead caused severe or hyperinflation. Money was increasingly becoming virtually worthless, such that workers needed to carry sacks of money in order to buy small domestic items. Prices shot up in a spell of minutes, among other economic disasters in Germany, which increased the suffering of the Germans. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 made Germany to lose her colonial empire in Africa. But Versailles, Germany was forced to renounce all claims over her colonies in Africa as they were all put under the custodianship of the League of Nations. For example, Namibia, Tanganyika and Togo were among such colonies that went to Britain and France to take care of them on behalf of the League of Nations. Because these colonies were sources of wealth, the Germans felt bitter since the loss of these colonies had greatly undermined their overseas commerce and trade. Questions. 1. Assess the impact of the Versailles Settlement of 1919 on Europe. 2. How did the Versailles Settlement of 1919 influence European affairs between 1919 and 1939? 3. The Versailles Treaty of 1919 was meant to prevent the outbreak of another war. Discuss. 4. The Versailles Treaty of 1919 was bound to lead to another world crisis. Discuss. 5. The viability of the Versailles Peace Treaty was questionable right from the start. Discuss. 6. To what extent did the Versailles settlement solve the problems of the peacemakers? 7. Explain the significance of the Versailles Peace Treaty in the history of Europe up to 1939. 8. Assess the impact of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference on Europe or East and Central Europe between 1919 and 1940. Note, the impact here should include all the effects or influence of all the 5 treaties in the area. 8. For example, 1. It led to the establishment of the League of Nations. 2. It led to the creation of new states. 3. It led to the humiliation of Germany and her allies. 4. It exposed the treacherous intentions of the European statesmen. 5. Led to the loss of the overseas colonies of Germany. 6. Led to Germany's loss of enormous territory in Europe. 7. Led to France's repossession of Alsace and Lorraine. 8. It also stimulated the growth of German nationalism. 9.